The evening air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the kind that clung to your skin and settled in your bones. Daniel leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, watching the man in front of him with the quiet calculation of a predator. Rhett stood a few feet away, his stance loose, but his fingers twitched at his sides. A tell. He was trying too hard to look unaffected. "I told you once," Daniel said, his voice low, deliberate. "Stay off my property." Rhett exhaled a sharp breath, his lips twitching into something between a smirk and a sneer. "And I told you," he murmured, tilting his head. "This ain't just your town anymore." The words landed heavier than Daniel expected. It wasn't just arrogance. It was certainty, and that made his stomach tighten. A wind cut through the space between them, rustling the trees that stood like silent sentinels along the road. The headlights from Daniel's truck threw long shadows, stretching Rhett's figure into something twisted and unnatural. Daniel clenched his jaw. The fence had been cut again tonight, the second time this week. Not vandalism. A message. He knew Rhett had done it. What he didn't know was why. "What's your angle?" Daniel asked, his voice steady. "You pulling this stunt for yourself? Or is it Marlene whispering in your ear?" At the mention of her name, Rhett's face twitched. Just for a second, but Daniel caught it. "You talk too much," Rhett said, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off something heavier than just the conversation. "Maybe you ought to be more worried about what you don't know." There it was. The shift. Not a warning. An omen. Daniel held his ground as Rhett turned, stepping back into the darkness like he belonged there. But before he disappeared completely, he glanced over his shoulder. His grin was slow, deliberate. "Hope you're ready, Daniel," he said. "Storm's coming." And then he was gone. Daniel didn't move right away. His breath was steady, controlled, but his fingers twitched at his side. The air felt colder now, the silence heavier. This wasn't just some petty back and forth. Rhett wasn't just playing games anymore, and that meant Daniel needed to be ready. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The night smelled of rain, damp earth, and something metallic in the air. Daniel knelt beside the wooden post, fingers tracing the jagged carving cut deep into the grain. Not just vandalism, a warning, a crude symbol. 3. Intersecting lines, sharp as claw marks, etched into his property like a brand. It wasn't random. He'd seen it before, years ago, in a different place, tied to a man who thrived on control. Rhett. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. The broken fence last week was one thing. This was something else. Behind him, gravel crunched under hesitant footsteps. "Daniel." He turned. Earl Whitman, his nearest neighbor, stood just beyond the fence line, arms crossed tight over his chest like he was holding something in. His face was paler than usual, eyes flicking to the symbol before settling on Daniel. "You need to let this go," Earl muttered. "Rhett's not a man you want on your bad side." Daniel wiped his fingers on his jeans and stood. "Already there, aren't I?" Earl's mouth twitched. "Then you need to get out while you can." Daniel studied him. Earl wasn't the type to scare easy, but his voice was taut, stretched thin with something heavier than concern. "You know something?" Daniel said. Earl swallowed, glancing around like the trees might be listening. Years ago, before Rhett left this town, there was a family, a father and son. They crossed him. He exhaled sharply, voice dropping. "They ain't here anymore." The words settled in Daniel's chest like stones. He already knew Rhett was dangerous. But this was different. Earl hesitated, then took a step closer. "And that symbol?" His voice dropped lower. "It was left on their door before they disappeared." A slow, cold dread crept up Daniel's spine. Earl shook his head. "Rhett doesn't make threats. He makes graves." The wind picked up, carrying the distant creak of rusted metal from the barn. Daniel glanced back at the carved warning, the deep grooves almost black against the wood. This wasn't a game anymore, and if Rhett wanted to play, Daniel was done waiting to make his next move. The diner hummed with low conversation, the clatter of silverware against ceramic barely masking the tension that settled over the place like a thick fog. Daniel sat in the corner booth, his back to the wall, watching the way people moved, who looked away too quickly, who pretended not to see. him at all. Karen's influence ran deep here, deeper than most realized. He stirred his coffee, though it had long gone cold as the front door creaked open. Matt Carson stepped in, hesitant, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against his thigh. He spotted Daniel, let out a slow breath, and made his way over. "Got a minute?" Matt muttered, sliding into the booth without waiting for an answer. Daniel nodded. "Figured you'd come eventually." Matt gave a humorless smirk. "That obvious, huh?" Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. Matt had been running errands for Karen for years. Small things at first. Passing messages, setting up, meetings. But small things had a way of turning into big things, and Karen had a way of making sure nobody left her circle unless she decided they could. Matt glanced around before leaning in. "She knows you're asking questions," he said, voice just above a whisper. "And she doesn't like it." Daniel lifted his coffee cup, more to hide the shift in his expression than anything else. "I'd be surprised if she did," Matt exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't get it, man. Karen doesn't just get mad, she gets even. You know how many people have tried to push back against her?" Daniel set his cup down. "How many?" Matt's eyes darkened. "None that are still around." Silence stretched between them. Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. "How did she pull Rhett in?" Matt hesitated, his jaw tightening. "He owed her. Some deal, years ago. She helped him when no one else would. Now she owns him." He shook his head. "And he's too deep to get out." Daniel tapped his fingers against the table. A storm was brewing, and Karen was at the center of it, weaving her threads, pulling people in, deciding who stayed and who disappeared. Matt shifted in his seat, restless. "Look, I can't—" Daniel cut him off. "Why are you telling me this?" Matt swallowed. "Because I know what happens next, and I don't want to be part of it." Daniel studied him, reading the fear in his posture, the regret in his voice. "You already are," Daniel said. Matt flinched like he'd been hit. He stood quickly, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket and tossing them on the table. "Watch your back," he muttered. "She's already making her next move." Then he was gone. Daniel sat there a moment longer, then reached for his coffee, took a sip, and let the bitter taste settle on his tongue. Karen thought she controlled the board. She had no idea she was about to lose the game. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and fried food, but the tension in the air was sharper than any scent. Daniel pushed open the door, his eyes sweeping the room as conversations quieted just a fraction. People always noticed when someone like him walked in, especially now. He took a seat at the counter instead of his usual booth. A tactical choice, easier to watch the room. Harder for anyone to sneak up behind him. Lisa, the waitress, hesitated before coming over. The usual. "Yeah." Daniel kept his voice steady, casual, but his gut told him he wasn't alone in this place. Someone was watching. As she moved toward the kitchen, he caught the reflection of a man in the tarnished mirror behind the counter. Stranger, wrong posture for a local, too still, too focused. Daniel shifted his gaze just as the diner door creaked open again. Matt Carson walked in, looking like a man who regretted every life choice that led him to this moment. He spotted Daniel and hesitated, then made his way over, sliding onto the stool beside him. "Shouldn't be here," Matt muttered. Daniel didn't react. "And yet, here you are." Matt exhaled through his nose, keeping his hands flat on the counter. "She's got people everywhere." "Karen?" Matt gave a tight nod. "She's been busy, making calls, pulling strings, and Rhett—" He hesitated. Daniel leaned in slightly. "What about him?" Matt's fingers drummed against the counter. "He's not just doing this for her." His voice dropped lower. "He's got his own play. Something she doesn't know about." That was new. And dangerous. Before Daniel could press further, the man in the corner shifted. Just enough to let Daniel know he was listening. Daniel took his coffee and stood. "Walk with me." Matt hesitated, then followed him out onto the street. The air was thick with the promise of rain, the clouds pressing low over the town. They walked in silence until they reached an alleyway between the hardware store and an old repair shop. Daniel stopped, leaning against the brick wall. "Talk." Matt ran a hand through his hair. "Rhett's working both sides. He's playing Karen, but he's got something bigger lined up. I don't know what, but it's bad." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "How bad?" Matt swallowed hard. The kind that doesn't leave loose ends. A chill settled in Daniel's gut. He had been playing this as a game of survival, matching Karen move for move. But if Rhett had another agenda, something more dangerous than Karen's usual manipulation, then everything just shifted. Then I need to know what he's planning, Daniel said. Matt's gaze flickered to the street behind them. You don't get it. He's not just a thug anymore. He's thinking long-term. You're not just in his way, you're a liability. Daniel let that sit between them. Then he nodded, pushing off the wall. Then it's time I made my own move. He walked away without another word, already feeling the weight of the game shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't just about Karen anymore, and that meant the rules had changed. The night was thick with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that carried weight, like the town itself was holding its breath. Inside Daniel's house, the air was still. The faint hum of the fridge, the slow tick of the old wall clock, normal sounds, masking something unnatural, a click at the back door. Then a creak as it swung open. 2 figures slipped inside, their movements precise, practiced. Rhett led the way, his breath slow and measured. Evan followed, younger, less steady. A bead of sweat clung to his brow despite the cold night air. You sure about this? Evan whispered. Rhett shot him a look. Shut up and move. They weren't here to make a mess. This wasn't vandalism. It was about control, power, a message. Rhett moved through the dimly lit kitchen, his boots soundless against the floor. He knew exactly where to go, the office. That's where Daniel kept things locked up. Evan hovered by the doorway, hands twitching. What are we even looking for? Something useful, Rhett murmured. Something Karen can use, or something. I can. He tried the drawer first, locked, as expected. Daniel wasn't careless, but Rhett had come prepared. A small metal tool. A slow, practiced turn. Click, the drawer slid open, revealing a stack of documents, papers, letters, an old notebook. Rhett's fingers flipped through them until he found what he needed. A manila folder, thick and worn. He cracked it open just enough to glimpse the contents. His lips curled into a grin. Bingo. But just as he tucked the folder into his jacket, Evan made a noise. A sharp inhale. Rhett turned fast. What? Evan stood near the fireplace, holding something in his hands. A small, old wooden box. His face was pale. This isn't just business, is it? Evan muttered. You hate him. Rhett's jaw tightened. Put it down. Evan hesitated, then placed the box back, exactly where he found it. Rhett exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to steady. He had to focus. He had what he came for. Let's go. They slipped out the way they came, vanishing into the night like shadows dissolving into darkness. When Daniel pulled into his driveway hours later, something felt wrong. The house looked the same, but instincts honed over years of war and loss sent a warning through his bones. He stepped out of his truck, eyes scanning the yard, the porch, the door. No broken windows, no obvious damage. But the lock, a fraction of a second's hesitation before it turned too smoothly. Daniel stepped inside, breath steady, forcing himself to move slowly. The kitchen was untouched. The living room, just as he left it. Then he saw the office door, slightly ajar. His stomach went cold. Daniel walked in, eyes moving straight to the desk. The drawer was open, just enough to be noticeable. He pulled it all the way. His documents were gone. His gut twisted. Not just a break-in, a surgical hit, a calculated move. Then his eyes landed on the fireplace, on the wooden box. His breath locked in his throat. He strode over, flipping it open. It was empty. Something inside him shifted, an old dangerous part of him waking up. This wasn't about Karen anymore. This was about Rhett. Daniel clenched his fists. The game had just changed, and he was done playing defense. The storm had passed, but the air still carried a charge. A quiet hum of tension, like something waiting to snap. Daniel sat in his truck, parked just beyond the tree line, watching the glow from his house in the distance. He'd left the lights on, made it look lived in, like he was inside, moving through the rooms, unaware. It was bait, and they would take it. His phone screen flickered, showing the live feed from the cameras he'd hidden around the property, the new ones. the ones no one knew about. His pulse was steady, but his fingers curled around the gear shift like he was holding something sharper. Come on, show me your next move. The first shadow appeared just after midnight. Rhett. Daniel recognized. The way he moved, slow, deliberate, like a man who had done this before. A second figure followed. Karen. Daniel's jaw tightened. It wasn't like her to get her hands dirty. She preferred to let people do it for her. But tonight was different. Rhett made a beeline for the shed where Daniel had left the planted evidence. A stack of papers, carefully arranged to suggest something dangerous, records, transactions, notes, fake enough to be useless, but real enough to stir paranoia. Karen stayed back, scanning the area. Watching, Rhett disappeared inside. Now. Daniel moved. By the time Daniel stepped out of the shadows, Rhett was already holding the papers. His fingers gripped the edges too tight, eyes scanning the words, jaw twitching. Something interesting? Daniel's voice was calm, but his presence hit like a hammer. Karen spun around, her mask of confidence slipping for half a second. Rhett didn't move, didn't speak, but Daniel saw it, a crack. The trap had worked. I was wondering how long it'd take you to show your hand, Daniel continued, stepping closer. Didn't expect you to bring her along, though. His gaze flicked to Karen. Guess you're running out of patience. Karen's lips curled. I could say the same for you. You could. Daniel nodded. But I've already won. This round. He held up his phone. On the screen, a paused video feed. Rhett, in perfect clarity, breaking into the shed, hands on the fake documents. Karen's expression barely changed, but Rhett's did. A shift, a flicker of something deeper. Then frustration. Daniel caught it. He pressed. This was never about Karen, was it? His voice dropped just enough to make Rhett's fingers twitch. You're not doing this for her. You're doing it for you. Karen's gaze snapped to Rhett, sharp and questioning. What is he talking about? Rhett didn't answer. His grip on the papers tightened. His body went still. Daniel took another step. You don't even trust her, do you? Rhett's nostrils flared. Karen took a careful step back. You're wasting your time, Daniel. Maybe. He kept his eyes on Rhett. Or maybe I just found the real weak link in all of this. The silence stretched. Then Rhett moved, fast, but not at Daniel, at Karen. He grabbed her wrist, too hard, too sudden. Karen's mask slipped completely, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to fear. What the hell are you? You set me up, Rhett muttered, his voice low, shaking. You didn't tell me he was ready for this. Daniel didn't move. He didn't need to, because the cracks had already turned into fractures. And this was what he'd been waiting for. The real war was about to begin. The town had always whispered about Karen, but whispers weren't enough. Daniel needed proof. And tonight, he'd get it. He sat in his truck outside Murphy's bar, where Karen's inner circle gathered. Contractors, business owners, people she'd twisted into favors and silence, the ones who owed her. But debts could be broken. He reached for his phone and dialed. You ready? A pause. Then the sheriff's steady voice. We're in position. Showtime. Inside, Karen sat in her usual booth, laughing like she wasn't a cornered animal. Rhett sat beside her, stiff, unreadable. The others, Murphy, Carter, Gina, watched too carefully. They weren't here for drinks. They were waiting. Daniel pushed through the door, the shift in energy immediate. Tension, sharp as glass. Karen's smirk flickered. I was wondering when you'd show up. Daniel slid into the booth across from her, ignoring Rhett's stare. Funny. I was wondering how long you could keep up the act. Karen tilted her head. What act? The one where you think no one sees the knife you're holding behind your back. Silence. A muscle in Rhett's jaw jumped. Gina looked. Away. Murphy cleared his throat. The cracks were already there. Daniel just needed to widen them. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A recording played. Rhett and Karen in the shed, their voices low but clear. Karen. I don't care. What you have to do, just handle it. Rhett. And if he doesn't scare easy? Karen. Then you make him. The room went still. Karen's expression hardened. That recording doesn't prove anything. Daniel leaned forward. You're right. That's why I brought something better. The front door opened. A woman stepped in, bruises fading, eyes sharp. Rachel Carter. Karen's mask finally cracked. Rachel's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. You said I owed you. That if I didn't do what you asked, you'd ruin me. Her gaze swept the table. How many of you heard the same thing? More silence. Then slowly, Murphy looked down. Gina swallowed hard. Carter exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. And Rhett? He stood, his chair scraping the floor. You lied to me. Karen turned to him, voice low, urgent. Don't be stupid. But the damage was done. Rhett wasn't her weapon anymore. Daniel saw it in his eyes. Betrayal, anger, and something darker. You think I don't know what you did to me? Rhett's voice was quiet, but his fists clenched. All those times you said it was for the best? That we were in control? He let out a short, bitter laugh. You just needed someone to take the fall. Karen's fingers twitched toward her purse. Daniel tensed, but before she could move, the sheriff stepped in. Handcuffs clicked. Karen's eyes burned as the sheriff pulled her to her feet. You think this town will forget me? She spat. Daniel stood, calm, steady, unshaken. They won't have to, he said. They'll just remember what you really are. And as the sheriff led her out, the town finally saw Karen Harper for what she had always been. A fraud, a liar, and a woman who had finally lost her grip. Silence had weight. It pressed down on the town in the days after Karen Harper was taken away. Her house sat empty, its windows staring like hollow eyes. The porch light still flickered at dusk, a broken remnant of a woman who once controlled everything. Now she had nothing. Daniel watched from his truck, parked just up the road. They said she'd be gone by morning, but Karen Harper had never been. The kind to go quietly. The knock came at midnight. Daniel was expecting it. He opened the door to find Karen standing there, disheveled, but still wearing that sharp, knowing smirk. You've won, she said, voice smooth but brittle. For now. Daniel didn't speak. She stepped forward. I have resources, contacts outside of this place, people who could make things disappear for both of us, like you made Rachel Carter disappear? His tone was cold even. Karen's smile faltered, just a flicker, then softer. You don't want to start a war you can't finish, Daniel. Daniel's grip on the door tightened. This wasn't an apology. It was a warning. He stepped back, nodding toward the empty road. You should go before the sheriff drives by. For the first time, something unreadable flashed in Karen's eyes, and then she left. Not a word. No final power play, just the sound of her footsteps fading into the night. By morning, Karen was gone, but her shadow remained. At the diner, voices were hushed, heads turned. People whispered about what they knew all along, but had been too afraid to say. Murphy shook his head over a cup of coffee. Saw this coming years ago. Gina wiped the counter, avoiding Daniel's gaze. We all did. But where had they been when it mattered? Daniel didn't say it. He didn't have to. That evening, Daniel stood outside his home, breathing in the crisp air. The town felt different. Lighter, maybe, but as he stepped onto his porch, he noticed the envelope, tucked neatly beneath the welcome mat. No name. No return. Address. He picked it up, fingers steady as he tore it open. Inside, a single piece of paper. A message, scrawled in sharp, deliberate handwriting. This isn't over. Daniel exhaled slowly. Karen was gone. But the game was still being played. What do you think about this story? Have you ever seen someone get put in their place like this? Where are you watching from? I love seeing how far our community reaches. Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. Your support means the world.